Um, so for those who are attending remotely, thanks for tuning in. I'm Brian Vanderwende. I'm a member of the Consulting Services Group here in CISL. We're the folks who answer the support tickets and give trainings like these. So the intention of today's presentation is to really give a kind of a general overview of using Globus here at NCAR. There's multiple ways to interact with the Globus service and multiple things that you can accomplish using Globus here. And there's a couple things where Globus probably isn't the ideal solution as well. So part of the intention will be to kind of explain when is a good time to use Globus in your workflow. And I would say for the folks who are online, if you have any questions, I think we'll hold those until the end of the talk, but there should be plenty of time to address anything that comes in. So if you have a question, just type it into the chat box, and then we'll get to those at the end. And if folks in here have a question at any point, feel free to, like if it's a clarifying question, feel free to let me know. All right, so Globus, generally speaking, is a tool for fast and reliable data transfers between internal and external storage platforms. And by that, I mean internal to NCAR, as well as external, like other laboratories and university storage as well. Anywhere that really has a Globus endpoint set up. So these Globus transfers, they use what's called the grid FTP protocol. This has been around for a long time. And really, Globus is something that came about, it's been over a decade now, to really package that into a service that's easy to use and kind of, yeah, more user-friendly. So the nice thing about the grid FTP protocol is that it can send multiple chunks of data in parallel, big chunks of data using multiple data streams. This is something that like a basic command line utility like rsync doesn't do. And therefore, as long as you've got the basically a big enough pipe to transfer data over, you can achieve pretty high transfer rates for moving large pieces of data across sites. Grid FTP also allows and enables fault-tolerant transfers. So, if a transfer gets broken, if the connection is broken between the two endpoints, you can resume a transfer if for some reason network connectivity is poor. Now, generally these endpoints are between sites that are very reliable, so that isn't too much of an issue. But if you're transferring terabytes or even petabytes of data, take a while. If the transfer is broken at any point, you can resume that using grid FTP and therefore using Globus. And the nice thing is that the Globus service automatically resumes halted transfers. So there are some other utilities that allow this restart of a broken transfer, but you have to do it manually. Here, the Globus service will say, okay, that endpoint's come back online. And an endpoint in this case, I'll get into the terminology, but the endpoint is just a source or a destination storage platform. It'll say that that platform is back online. Let me get that transfer going again behind the scenes. So that's one thing it's one value add the Globus service really has, is it once you schedule your transfer, it manages it for you in the background. And there's multiple ways to interact with the Globus service. So the transfers can be made either at the command line or via the web interface. And they've put a lot of work into that web interface over the last couple of years to kind of really expand it into more of a fully featured file explorer. So, I would say the web interface provides a GUI, and it makes cross-platform transfers easy as well, because that web interface is going to look the same if you're on a Mac or if you're on a Windows PC or a Linux PC. So, in that sense, you get a very similar experience, regardless of how you're approaching Globus. And I would also say the Globus service, it attempts to manage multiple accounts with many varied means of authentication. And by and large, it does a good job of this. I do find it a bit tricky at times because it will try to link any account that you sign in to into kind of one unified login session. And that can be a bit confusing if you want to log out of one, log into another. but you know, once you kind of get used to the way it thinks, it's not too bad. I'd also just like to say that, in our opinion, Globus is not, however, a data management tool. So, and that's, I guess that's a little hard to see in here, but you know, there's this web file manager. It looks, you know, something like, you know, a file explorer in Mac or in Windows, but you know, it's not as powerful as if you're managing your files on like the command line or using something native to your operating system, though it does have some capabilities. You can list directory contents, you can move files or directories, you can certainly, the basis of a transfer is a copy operation. You can also delete files and folders from this interface. But these operations don't have the versatility of the equivalent command line tools like CP or move or remove. Certainly not as many options. One important thing to keep in mind is that Globus transfers don't preserve the file permissions as they are on the source storage platform. Instead, when you move data from a source to a destination, the permissions that that data has, that those files or directories have on the destination are your default permissions, is if you created a new directory or a file on that destination. So, you know, that's just something to be aware of if you're moving a lot of varied data. One side effect that we saw when people were using Globus to move things from, say, our Scratch storage to campaign storage is some folks were moving things like binaries, and binaries will lose execution permissions if you make a transfer, because generally by default files don't have execution permissions on new files don't on storage platforms. So if you do move a lot of data that has like a varied set of permissions, you might think about doing something like putting it into a tarball first, and that tarball, once you expand it at the destination, will still have those that permission metadata. That's one way to get around that. Also, symbolic links are skipped in a transfer. So this is something that I think has been a something that they've talked about at Globus, how to manage symlinks. Part of the difficulty is they want the experience to be the same across all platforms, but symbolic links are kind of a different concept in Windows. So how to handle that properly, and the way that they've chosen to do, at least up till now, is just to say, if you have symbolic links, we're just not going to copy them. So, you know, if you have a directory structure that has a lot of symbolic link dependencies, then that's not going to be copied as you might think in a Globus transfer. So, having said that, when should you look at using Globus? And, you know, this isn't a full list of scenarios, but these are the ones that I think make a lot of sense. So if you're transferring any significant amount of data, and I would say in this case, you know, greater than or equal to 100 megabytes feels reasonable to me, to or from an external site that supports Globus. So, you know, if you have data here that you want to move to university storage that's, you know, of significant size, and that university storage has a Globus endpoint attached to it, then Globus is a great way to go, because it's, again, it's going to handle that in the background, and it's going to be a robust transfer that you can then track. Also, if you are moving large amounts of data between NCAR endpoints, so we have an endpoint for the Glade storage, we have an endpoint for campaign storage. There's a couple of others floating around in there that are tied to NCAR. And you want to transfer to be managed in the background. You know, if you're moving a lot of data in the command line, then you have to be careful that your command line session doesn't get interrupted, because that could interrupt the transfer. Whereas if you schedule it via Globus transfer, then that, you know, it doesn't matter if you're paying attention to it or if you're attached to the service, it's going to happen in the background. And then the third case I can think of is that you would want to share data that you have on, say, Glade with external collaborators who don't have access to our storage systems. And you can do that via our data sharing service, which is something I'll talk more about later, but basically you prepare the data and then create a Globus endpoint that points to that data that other people can then access outside of NCAR. Okay, so before saying endpoint too much without defining it, so the basics of a Globus transfer, basically you have selected data that you schedule to be transferred between two collections via these grid FTP endpoints. And again, the endpoints are just the storage platforms. The collections are essentially the data on the storage platforms. The Globus folks in their documentation, they've used endpoint as the term for a source and destination for a long time. Now they're kind of switching to this collections definition. So you'll see both of them if you look at the Globus documentation, but essentially for our purposes, a collection and an endpoint are the same. This transfer is then managed in the background and the result is logged on the Globus servers. So all the information pertaining to the transfer is kind of stored in the cloud on the Globus service. And that's why it's accessible in multiple ways, in multiple places. So essentially what you're doing is from your machine, which could be your workstation, or it could be Cheyenne, or anywhere that you have access to the Globus service, you send a request to that service, and then that service manages your transfer. So the service will talk to the source endpoint and the destination endpoint, and the data is obviously it's only going between those endpoints. It doesn't have to travel through that service or have anything to do with your machine. Basically, the point here is that all of the data operations happen here with the endpoints, but the transfer metadata and the transfer information is stored in this Globus service in the cloud. And that's what you interact with from your machine. The downside, perhaps, of this approach is that a Globus transfer can require up to 3 logins. First, you have to make sure you're logged into the Globus service to schedule your transfers. And then you have to log in to both the source and destination endpoints. And certain sites may have kind of unified authentication. So when you authenticate to one, you're authenticated to the other as far as the endpoints go. So you might only have to do 2. But in any case, you have to be logged into the service to start a transfer. And unless those endpoints are open access, you have to log into those as well. So there are multiple ways to use the Globus service here at NCAR, and I'm going to talk about 3 of them. So the first method, and the one that's kind of very intuitive, is to use the graphical interface on the web at globus.org. And basically what you would do here is you would go to www.globus.org. The first thing you'll do is you'll log into the web service itself, and they'll provide you with a drop down for various organizational login approaches there, because basically if your organization has a supported login method, you can use that to log into the Globus web service. Now here at NCAR, we don't have a dedicated method for NCAR users. There is an NCAR RDA login option, so that's tied into the RDA accounts, but if you are using this as basically an NCAR computing user, I would say don't use that one. Instead, either create a Globus ID. We used to advocate doing the Globus ID because it allows you to create SSH keys, and that was important for the old command line interface to Globus. They've since deprecated that and switched that method out. And it sounds like, from talking to the Globus folks, that they're kind of deprecating the Globus ID in general. So you probably don't need to create that anymore. Another option, since if you are an NCAR employee, for example, then you have an NCAR Google account, you can use that to sign in, and that's probably the best way to go there. But if you're a university user and your university has some authentication method, you can use that as well. So you can certainly look up your organization in this dropdown. And ultimately, as long as you have some method to access the web service, it doesn't matter too much, I would say, which login method you're using, because it's going to be the same user experience. Then what you'll do is you'll search for a collection. Again, this is kind of them switching their terminology, but in this case, we're also looking for an endpoint. Here I'm searching for NCAR Glade, which is the name of the endpoint for the Glade storage. We also have NCAR Campaign Storage is the other one that I'll point out today. And then, you'll see that show up in the list of available options. And as long as you're fairly specific here, you won't be overwhelmed with, a giant list. Like if you type in just campaign, I'm guessing you're probably going to see a lot of stuff. And then once you click on that endpoint or that collection, you'll see the authentication method that site wants you to use to access that storage platform. And here at NCAR, our Glade and our campaign storage are behind our two-factor authentication. So in this case, you'll use whatever you typically use to access our HPC systems, either Duo is more likely at this point, or a YubiKey if you're still using those, or some combination of those. And then that endpoint will be activated. You can customize the amount of time that it's activated, but by default, it's activated for 24 hours. So, if I leave the website and I go back in an hour, let's say, then I should still have my Globus service login and my login to the Glade storage active. So you can kind of go back and forth throughout a workday. And I'll show this in my browser as well. Maybe it'll show up a little bit better in here. But then when you're logged into the service and you're logged into the endpoints, what you'll do, presumably, is go into the file browser here and then set up your transfer. So in this case, they've kind of have a two-panel layout. You've got your one collection here, your other collection here. This shows in a very file explorer kind of way, or a finder kind of way, a listing of directories and files, and you just will select or multi-select what you want here, and then there's this start button, and that basically starts up the transfer, and it will send it to whatever the active folder is on the destination endpoint. So it's just like doing moving files around in a GUI interface, GUI file explorer. There are some options that you can select here as well for the transfer. By default, this is basically what you'll get, but you can label a transfer, which if you're doing a lot of these can be pretty useful just for tracking purposes. You can set it to be a sync transfer, which is basically saying I only want to move files around if they're updated or unavailable in the destination. So if you're doing a transfer multiple times and just trying to fill in gaps in data, that can be pretty useful. This option will delete files on the destination that don't exist on the source, so that further kind of specifies it as more like an rsync transfer, where you want the source and the destination endpoints to look exactly the same, at least that collection of data on the endpoints. You can preserve modification times as you would with a CP operation. You can verify the file integrity after the transfer, and this is something that's on by default. So that'll make sure that the data that was transferred is identical to the data that you started with on the source. And you can also encrypt a transfer if you want, which I think for our users is probably not a high priority, but that is an option in there as well.
You go first. Can you turn off the file integrity check?
Yes, yeah. All of these are selectable checkboxes, so
Okay.
everything can be turned on or off. That's good.
I guess two questions. How often does that thing actually do anything, and how do you know it did something?
The verify integrity?
Yeah.
Well, it's supposed to, you're saying how often during the transfer?
Or no, I guess what's the user experience? What happens if your files don't match?
I have never seen it.
Good.
So now, yeah, ultimately this is putting a little bit of faith into the service, and I think it would be interesting. And there's probably a white paper or something online where they explain exactly what they're doing, and they show testing of how that looks. I would go on the Globus website to see, but I personally haven't seen it flag a transfer.
I don't think we've ever received a complaint, user complaint.
Yeah, it's a good point though. You know, you want to make sure they're actually doing what they're advertising.
Yeah.
So, you know, one thing that you can look at least try to see what they report is after a transfer, there's a transfer, basically a logging screen. It will show you a list of recent transfers that you've done, and it will give you a decent amount of information behind those. So you have an overview and you also have an event log, and I think that event log would probably describe the verification step. We can check that in a minute. But this screen will give you, it'll give you various metadata, logs, and debug data as well if a transfer did fail. Again, that's not necessarily if the verification failed, but if, say that, for example, if you don't have permissions to the destination directory, then the transfer will fail. So that would be one case. But this debug data screen is kind of useful because they give this little button here to copy to your clipboard, and that's useful if you're reporting it to, say, our help desk or the Globus folks themselves. But again, you can use this information to track and confirm success. You can also look at transfer rates between the endpoints. So if, you know, we've had times where transfer rates have slowed down after starting out pretty fast. And, you know, that's something that then we look into with our storage team here to figure out why, but, you know, it doesn't happen too often. But if you're transferring, say, from a personal endpoint, which I'll talk about in a little bit, you might not have the fastest connection speeds. So you can look there to see if you're getting what you think you should be getting. And again, if you have any transfer faults, some of these are recoverable and some of them aren't. They can be viewed in the event log. So a recoverable fault would be like if the connection is broken, but then the connection resumes. An unrecoverable fault would be, again, like if you have trying to transfer to a directory that you don't have permissions to. One thing to be aware of is this metadata does not persist indefinitely in the web app, at least in the interface. So, you know, when I looked at my log, there was basically a couple of transfers that I had done to play around with this before preparing for this tutorial, but I hadn't seen any of the ones that I had done like 6 months ago when I did my last Globus tutorial. So probably that's more so to make it a manageable amount of data that you're looking at in a GUI. But just be aware that it's not like a record of all time. And if you do a ton of transfers, that's probably a good thing. I don't know what the period of time is that they keep the transfer on the screen though. So let's look at this real quick. So here's the, you know, here's the Globus website, globus.org. And starting off, you know, there's a lot of various information in here, but I don't have a mouse pointer, which makes this fun. But if I click login, then this is going to be a real challenge.
Does it show up on your screen?
No.
Yeah.
It's a good thing that these buttons have little bits of highlight. For me, you know, I'm going to just sign in with Google here, and then I'm going to try to pick my NCAR Google account. And since I'm already signed into that, then it just says, okay, now you're authenticated. And here I am in the file browser. So if I go to this activity tab, then I can see my recent transfers. So you can see the only one I actually have here is one from 2 days ago. If I click on history, still, so I, you know, I don't know what the amount of time is that it's actually keeping it in there. But if I click on this, I can see all this information about the transfer. I've basically just copied 3 files in a directory, so, and they were very small files. So not a lot to see here, but yeah, it's kind of the interface there. I would show you more, but it's really hard to click on things. Okay, so that's kind of the easiest method to get started with is the web interface. But you can get more information, and you can also, if you're just more comfortable in the command line, there is a Globus command line interface as well. So the CLI nowadays it's a Python package, and it enables command line interaction with the Globus service to again schedule and inspect transfers. So if you're moving data to and from like Glade and campaign storage, you might just want to do that at the command line. In that case, using the Globus service is probably extra steps, unless you're doing a really big transfer. But if you're moving to and from an external site, this might be a lot more useful than trying to do like SCP or rsync commands. It's available in the default user environment on the data access nodes, and if you've never been on these, we have these. They're basically virtual nodes that you can sign into SSH with your username, and then it's data-access.ucar.edu. These are, again, they're virtual machines. They don't have really any computing resources to speak of. They're just designed to navigate storage platforms and conduct data movement. But the Globus CLI will be in your environment by default there. You can also use it on Cheyenne and Casper via our Python package library. If you have, say, an Anaconda environment, the odds are that Globus may be installed in that environment as well, but that kind of depends on how you configure your environment and where you're downloading your packages. But by default, it's available in our package library. So you can load that with doing a module load Python and then activating the environment, and then these commands will be available. Now, I have this little asterisk here next to Cheyenne. The reason being is that the Globus CLI commands, they don't work on the Cheyenne batch nodes because the batch nodes aren't connected to the internet, and therefore they can't reach the Globus service. So you can run on the Cheyenne login nodes, you can run on the Casper login nodes, and you can run in Casper jobs because those all have web connectivity. But don't try to put these in a Cheyenne batch job. Oh, good, that's showing up pretty good. So a lot of text here, but I want to give basically some examples of authenticating and then setting up a transfer with the Globus CLI. So here I basically have, and this is a logged in Cheyenne session that I've kind of screen captured. So in this case, I would load the Python module. I'd activate our Python library, and then start using the Globus CLI commands. So the first one you'll want to do is you'll want to log in, do a Globus login. Basically, what it wants to do then is it'll give you an OAuth link. This is a web link that basically does that authentication that we did to log into the Globus service online. So it requires a little bit of interactivity here, and it also requires a web browser. But it will give you that website. That website will have you log in and then give you an authorization code, which you'll then copy and paste into your terminal. At that point, you'll be successfully logged in, hopefully, to the Globus service. Now, the nice thing here is, generally speaking, once you've logged into the Globus service, unless you manually log out, your session should be relatively permanent. Now, I have had occasions where I've been logged out and I didn't quite understand why. And this is also tied, it's the same login session basically as you're doing on the web. So if you log out in the CLI or if you log out in the web, it's going to affect the other. So this is one way that you can kind of accidentally log yourself out. But in an ideal situation, you should only have to do this Globus login step once on any particular computer. So once I've logged into the web service, then I want to start interacting with endpoints. And here, I guess again, I can't point to, but here, there, and sorry, I guess for the folks online, the next command is Globus endpoint search. And that's my way to get the endpoint ID. So I'm searching by a string. In this case, I know it's NCAR Glade, so I'm searching for that. And that would pretty much give me what I want because there aren't other ones called NCAR Glade. But if you're looking through a list of a lot of endpoints, then there are options to make it more manageable. So this filter owner ID, you can give basically an account that owns the endpoint. And for our NCAR Glade and NCAR campaign storage endpoints, they're owned by this account ncar@globusid.org. So if I filter by that owner, then I'll only see the endpoints that are managed by us. There's two other options I'm using here, this format Unix and this basically JavaScript query. And I'm doing that because the only field that I want here is the ID of the endpoint. So by default, it will give you kind of a list of information, and it will format it in a very kind of pretty text way. So you'd have to then do some copying and pasting. Whereas here I'm formatting it Unix, so it's like raw machine readable output, and I'm only asking for the ID field. So then it gives me this string. This starts with a D33, and that's the actual endpoint ID. It's long and laborious, but unique. So I don't want to really deal with that. So what I do is I just store that endpoint ID into an environment variable. Here I'm a bash user, so I'm doing EP glade equals and then that string. You know, if I was a C shell user, I could do set EP glade equals, but you know, same idea. And then now that I have that environment variable set, I can use that in all my further Globus commands, which is what I do next. So then I want to activate the endpoint. This is the same thing that we did in the web interface. So we logged into the service, and then we found the endpoint, and then we logged into the endpoint. Here I'm logging in with this Globus endpoint activate command. And you'll see at the end of that command, there's that $EP glade. So I'm using the ID that I've stored in the variable. Now there's some other options I'm using here. The most important one is the -- my proxy. That one tells it to use the my proxy activation method, which will basically use our two-factor authentication. So either Duo or YubiKey. And you'll just enter that information in the command line as you would when you're signing into Cheyenne. But there are some other options here that I think you should be aware of. So there's this -- force option. I like specifying that one because it will activate the endpoint, even if it's already activated. And the reason you'd want to do that is because the endpoint activation has an expiration. Again, if you activate it via the web, the default is 24 hours. If you activate it with CLI, the default is 12 hours. I'm not sure why the difference. But if you do the force, then it will start a new 12 hours instead of just saying, oh, well, you activated 10 hours ago, so I'm just going to use that activation and you have 2 hours left, which could be surprising. The other thing I specify is this no auto activate option. So this basically says to use the my proxy method, even if there's another authentication that's already active. And this, you know, that's basically the force and the no auto activate combination. Like when you combine those together, that makes sure that you're going to get a brand new activation every time that you activate an endpoint. Lastly, there's this my proxy lifetime, and that's how you can specify a longer activation period than 12 hours. And for our endpoints, the max that you can do is 720 hours or 30 days. So you can basically get a month out of an activation here. You'll see then that the output says I've successfully activated the endpoint using the my proxy server. So at that point, you know, if I want to confirm, if I don't believe it, I could check using, or if I just, you know, wanted to see if I still had an endpoint active, I could use this Globus endpoint is activated command. Again, I'm wanting a particular field here. So I'm asking for the expire time because I want to know how long my activation will last. But if I don't do the format Unix and the JavaScript query, the JQ expire time, then I'll get basically the default fields in a nicely formatted way to go. But you can see this one, you know, I found out that it was going to expire on the 19th at 20 UTC, or 21 UTC basically. So Okay, so now we've basically authenticated everything. What about file transfers? Again, I'm kind of in a bash shell here. So what I've done is I've run the Globus endpoint search to get the endpoint ID for the campaign storage as well, the NCAR campaign storage. And here I'm just using some bash syntax to store the output of that directly into a variable, so I don't have to do any copying and pasting. And then the important command here is this Globus transfer. So that's the command that starts up the transfer, schedules a transfer. And it's kind of a long command, so let's break it down. First, I'm specifying recursive because I'm transferring a directory and I want it to recursively copy all the data in there. I'm setting a synchronization level of modification time, so that's very similar to checking that checkbox in the GUI. But here, again, you have more flexibility with the CLI than you do with the web GUI. So here I could instead say, I think there's an option for creation time. There's an option for, you know, any synchronization level. So I don't care if the file already exists and it's the exact same. I think you can do a checksum as well. So it's going to check, you know, kind of to make sure that that checksum number is the same. So there's multiple sync levels, and those are documented in the Globus documentation. Finally, I'm giving this transfer a label. I'm calling it model project data storage. It's a string with you know, spaces in it, so that's fine as long as you encapsulate it in quotes. And then the most important part here is I'm describing what I want to transfer, and the format is you give the endpoint ID, which I've stored in environment variables, a colon, and then the path to the data. And you want to do that for the source endpoint first and the destination endpoint second. Otherwise, it looks very similar to, you know, like an SCP command in that regard. So assuming I've put in everything in properly, it will then say that the transfer has been accepted and that the task has been created and queued for execution. And then it's going to give you another nice long ID string, and that ID string is tied to your task. So that's how you can track the task after you've scheduled it. Again, here I'm going to store it in an environment variable so that I don't have to type it in or you know, copy and paste it all the time. And then I'm going to use that task ID to monitor this transfer. So there's a Globus task wait. That will basically kind of lock down your command line window until the transfer is finished. So it'll kind of make it feel like a more interactive command, I suppose. But you know, you might not want to wait forever if you think this transfer is going to take like, it should take like 10 minutes or something like that. So you can add a timeout as well in seconds. In this case, so I've waited the transfer. I know the transfer finished because the command's returned. So then I can do this Globus task show and give the task ID. And you can see here that it tells me the name, it tells me the ID, and then it tells me at the bottom that it's succeeded, that it's transferred 3 files in 1 directory. So my recursive transfer was successful. And then I put that ... there because there's a lot more that you get out of it. It just didn't fit on the screen. But you get a lot of information from this, and it's very similar to the information that you get on the activity tab on the website. 2 other info commands that I think can be useful. So Globus task show -- successful transfers in the transfer ID will give you a list of all the files that were copied. So you can get a roster of your transfer. And if it's a big transfer, that could be useful. And then this Globus task event list will give you that event log that you could get on the web interface as well. And here, again, I'm just redirecting the output to some files for later reference. Yeah.
So what is the Globus task wait command? What does that actually do?
All it's doing is it's basically pausing your terminal session until that command will just wait literally until the transfer sends back a status that it's finished. So you won't be able to run any more commands in that terminal session until the transfer is done. So that's not perhaps that useful when you're interactively doing things, but if you've got this command in a script and you want to make sure that data is transferred before the next command runs, you can basically use it to block.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Can you show unsuccessful transfers?
I don't think that option is in there. I would look on the documentation, but I'm just afraid of trying to navigate my browser right now. Okay. let's look at that real quick because I don't need a mouse to do this. So if I SSH to Cheyenne, NCAR.edu. I'm just going to authenticate real quick. Okay. So then I'll do a module load Python, maybe. I'll start up package environment. So then I can do a Globus login. And now, ooh, this could be tricky. Okay, well. So I can't do that really without a mouse pointer, but it's going to give this very long website that you can copy and paste into your browser, and then you'll get an authentication code, and you can run the subsequent commands there. Sorry for the lack of a live demo. Okay, so I said there's a third method. This one isn't native to Globus necessarily, but it's something that we've set up here at NCAR to kind of facilitate usage of the command line interface. So you can do a long-lived authentication with these two utilities that we provided, GCert and GCI. So again, the authentications to the Globus service should persist until you actively log out of the service. So that's essentially perpetual. But endpoint authentications have expirations, and this design is intentional. It's intended to protect your data. You don't want an authentication that's just forever, because somebody could hop onto your workstation, presumably go to globus.org and access all of your data if it's not secured. But the My Proxy authentication requires key press, and it requires browser interaction. Or it can require browser interaction depending on the way the endpoint's set up. So this doesn't permit or doesn't allow for robust unattended usage. If you want these things to run in a script, for example, and you need to authenticate an endpoint in a script, doing a duo authentication isn't going to work. So to try to facilitate unattended workflows, we've set up a mechanism where we can provide these InCommon certificates. It's just a type of security certificate that's offered online. And we've set up a way to authenticate our NCAR endpoints with these certificates that are stored basically in your home directory on Cheyenne. So this doesn't apply to external endpoints if they've got a mechanism, like if some university has a mechanism to do a perpetual authentication to their endpoint, that's kind of on them. This is just for Glade and campaign storage. But it's intended for basically for folks who want to use the Globus CLI in some scheduled manner, like in a cron job that runs regularly, or in a batch script. So this is a very high level. There's more details on our web documentation. But basically, if you want to acquire and set up and use one of these certificates, you would submit a support ticket to us and request one of these certificates. They're free. Once you've got that set up and once you have the certificate, then you would you download it basically from InCommon, and you would then upload it to Cheyenne. Into basically putting it in your home directory is an easy way to go. And then you would run this GCert command, which basically takes the InCommon certificate and munges it, it prepares it for use by the Globus commands. So once that's activated, then the certificate can be used to activate endpoints using the CLI. And here, it's the same Globus endpoint activate command. I'm using my force option, my no auto activate, but instead of using my proxy, I'm using delegate proxy, and I'm pointing it to the name of my certificate file, which by default, this GCert command will name it, it'll put it in your home directory, and it'll name it your username -globus.cert. So if you have the certificate available and you use this exact command, it should work. And again, you need to set a lifetime, so it's still, the authentication itself still is limited to 30 days. But since you have that certificate in there, you can use the certificate to activate it in a script, and you won't have to have any interactive usage. So it's still a good idea to activate the endpoint whenever you want to use it. It's just with that certificate available, it doesn't require any human interaction. And another way you could do it is you could also rerun the gcert command anytime to activate the endpoint. So that command will actually run this command for you to activate Glade and campaign storage if you don't want to do it manually. Now, side by side with that, we've also provided this GCI utility, which kind of mimics a bit the HSI interface to tape, which is going away. But it has like a put and a get operation, and it kind of works that way to talk between Glade and campaign storage. So it provides kind of simpler commands to move files between those two endpoints. One thing that we've added, hopefully value add here, is it respects relative and absolute paths, which the CLI commands don't. So if you're using the Globus transfer command, you want to give absolute paths. But here it'll recognize like, okay, I'm looking on campaign storage, so I know it's going to be a Glade campaign path. And it automatically authenticates with Glade and campaign storage using a certificate if you have it available. So you can just run a transfer and it will make sure that your endpoints are activated. Now it can't make sure that you're logged into the web service because that does require you to go to the website. So you want to make sure that that Globus login step is active for that's done. But again, once you do it once, it should last. And just to give you a little flavor of how these look. So if I wanted to transfer a data file from a working directory on Glade to a campaign storage space, it would like GCI put, and then the data file, and then a colon, and then the path to where what I want the data file to look like on campaign storage. So it's a lot smaller syntactically than the Globus transfer command. Let's say I wanted to conditionally transfer or sync by modification time, basically, a data directory from campaign storage to my working directory on Glade. So I wanted to pull something from campaign storage. I could do this GCI cget with a -r for recursive, and then the path to the data directory on campaign storage. And here I'm just using the shell to say use the present working directory command. So put it in my present working directory. Okay. So those are kind of the three methods to interact with. Just a couple of other little things. You can use your workstation as an endpoint with this utility that they provide called Globus Connect Personal. So when you download this utility, it's available for Windows, for Mac, for Linux. Whenever that's active and whenever your workstation is powered up and connected to the internet, it will show up as an endpoint that you've named in the Globus service. And you can access that via the web. You can access it via command line, any of the normal ways you would go. So again, your workstation becomes an endpoint that you can use for transfers with any other endpoint. And it's active whenever you're connected. Again, it's a little hard to read here, but basically you have that window that's inside there is the actual utility. It's very small, but you can set a number of folders or directories on your workstation that you want to be visible to the endpoint. So it's not your entire hard disk, unless you configure it to be. And then you name the endpoint, and then it shows up like any other endpoint in the web interface there. And one thing that you can do right now, by default, when you create these, they're set to private, but you can also make them public endpoints as well. So if you want somebody else to be able to pull some files from a directory that you've allowed them to from your workstation, that's kind of a nice way to allow them to initiate that rather than you having to initiate it. And the utility is available from the Globus website, from globus.org, Globus Connect Personal. If you Google Globus Connect Personal, it'll be the first thing to come up. I also talked about sharing data from Glade, for example, with external collaborators. We do allow this using the data sharing service, so you can't do it from any directory. This is kind of by request. But if you have a Cheyenne account, you can request a data sharing space. And from that space, you can serve data to individuals using the Globus endpoint. So the default shared space quota that you would get would be 50 terabytes. And that space is only accessible via Globus or via the data access nodes. The idea there being, you know, we don't want people to run like models outside of this data sharing space. It's not the intention. And also the files that are in this data sharing space are not backed up. And after 45 days of inactivity, those files are deleted. So it's really kind of a short-term sharing location, not a repository. And the permissions on those files are managed in terms of people being able to access them. They're managed via Globus. So Globus, on their website, they do have a pretty extensive permission system for access through endpoints. So it's not the file permissions that you would see in Unix, for example, on the command line. It's a different additional set of permissions for files purely when you're looking through endpoints. And this, you know, again, this is kind of what that looks like. You have a path. I can share it with a specific user. I can share it with a group of users, or I can share it with all users of the Globus service. I can give it read or write permissions. Again, there's no execute because you're not going to execute something through Globus. And then I can specify those via their email addresses. So again, if you Google NCAR data sharing service, you'll get this link to this website, and that'll have more detail about it. But you would basically start the process by sending us a support ticket. And then some final tips for using Globus at NCAR. So the authentication of the Glade and the campaign storage endpoints is actually linked. Kind of alluded to that earlier. So if you authenticate to Glade, then you are automatically authenticated to the campaign storage endpoint as well for the lifespan of that authentication. So by default, 24 hours on the website, 12 hours in the CLI. So that means you don't have to authenticate to both. However, if you're using the CLI, you will have to get the endpoint ID of both for use in the transfers. Yep. If you authenticate an endpoint on the website, it will be active in the command line and vice versa as well. So this is all managed by that cloud service that the Globus service itself is, you know, hosted. It's hosted in the cloud. So you're accessing the same thing regardless of which method you use. And there's also, I haven't really talked about this, but there's a Globus Python API as well. So you can use that programming interface to interact with the Globus service in a very like Pythonic programmatic way, and basically integrate Globus commands into your applications that you're writing. So the Globus CLI is actually a, you know, it uses the Globus API under the hood to talk to the Globus web service. So this is, it's just a more programmatic way of using Globus commands directly in Python, but it also, you know, it's quite a bit more, I would say, effort to use the API, just in terms of the number of commands to accomplish a task, than by using one of these user-facing services like the CLI or the web. So that's about all I have. If you need any assistance with Globus, or of course anything else, you can go to the Getting Help website. You can also walk into our suite here at Mesa Lab if you're up here. Support.ucar.edu is the main way to talk to us, submitting a help ticket on the research computing side of the help desk. And of course, you can give us a call during office hours as well. If you have specific questions from today, or if you have feedback on this presentation, you can email me. There's my email address. If anything comes up later, feel free to as well. And with that, I'll take any other questions that are in here or in the chat. So thanks. Yeah.
Brian, there are a few in the chat area, if you could take a look at them.
I don't know if I can very easily because I don't have a mouse pointer, but let me take this question in the room here, and then if you could read them, that would be terrific. So first off, yeah.
I was just wondering if the slides would be available.
Oh, yeah, so the question was, will the slides be available? We will have the slides and a recording of this talk on the website. Should be up in a few days. And an email will go out to anybody who's registered for those resources.
Thank you.
Okay, BJ.
Okay, there was one question that I think I answered correctly. Is the Glade password the CIT password or UCAS? And I said the CIT password. Another question, does the file integrity verification take some amount of time? In other words, how long might that take?
Yeah, so I don't know exactly how much time it would take, but it is an additional step. Yeah, so it will take a little bit of time. And I'm sure that scales based on the amount of data and the number of files that you've transferred. But I don't have a good feeling of how much additional time that takes. I would, one thing you could try, I would say, is if you have an example transfer that's representative of transfers you want to do, to try to do it once without and once with, and get a feel for that before you scale up to bigger amounts of data. But they may also have some information on that on the Globus website as well.
Okay, the next one is a two-part thing about campaign storage data. How long are campaign storage data archived? And do you receive notice if files or directories are scheduled for deletion?
Yeah, so that's it's kind of more of a general campaign storage question than a Globus question. The intention, as I've last heard, for campaign storage data is for it to have a 5-year lifespan.
From create date.
From the creation date, not from the access date. So, the idea philosophically is that it's a storage platform to get you from the start of a project to publication. So that 5-year lifespan is supposed to facilitate that. And I think in terms of notification, campaign storage has only been around for, I think, like a year and a half. So that aspect of it, we haven't necessarily broached yet, because we're not anywhere close to the deletion of any files.
Plans are that we would.
Yeah. So, the plan is, I think, that we'll try to notify folks in some manner, but I think the details of that haven't been ironed out yet. BJ, I'm going to take a question in the room here, real quick.
So I'm with a networking crew, and I guess our question about this is in real life, what happens when things break? So if you set up an endpoint, you start a transfer, and then you disconnect the laptop, let's say, from the network. Come back later, 10 hours later, reconnect. Does it seamlessly start the transfer again? Is there problems with, sequencing and dead jobs and incomplete jobs and confusion, in real life? Yeah,
so I mean, that's kind of the general theme is robustness, I suppose, and it's kind of a little complicated, I would say. I can only speak to my personal experience, but in the case of like, the simplest case, let's say like I'm doing a transfer from my workstation and then I forget or something and I power it down, and I bring it back up 10 hours later. If that Globus Connect personal service is active on my laptop, then I have seen it just kind of seamlessly start back up. And it might have to, go a little bit back in the transfer just to make sure that the data has integrity. But it's not like it's starting the whole transfer over, and it's not like it's hanging around there in perpetuity as a kind of zombie transfer. Having said that, I have also seen cases where one thing that is done that I don't really like is if you schedule a transfer and that transfer, for whatever reason, be it permissions or something, can never be fulfilled, it will recognize the fault and it will stop trying to transfer data, but it won't say the transfer failed. It will kind of just hang. Yeah, it'll live there in the background. And I don't think it's really using any resources, at least not on our system. It may be using some resources on the Globus service in the cloud. But I don't like that, because then I have these transfers that are lingering around. So one thing I've done with that GCI utility in that method 3 is it will report a fault like that, even though it doesn't kill the transfer. So I'll look for those faults and cancel a transfer and let you know if that's the
So from the
case.
user perspective, is there a log or something that would explain what state you're in?
Yeah, so if you go to the website or if you go in the CLI and look at that event log, it will list all of the faults that it's run into and whether or not it recovered from them.
Do you ever have issues where, you start a transfer of, let's say, a large directory, and then halfway through the user forgets, comes back, goes in and deletes some files out of that directory before they've been transferred or such like, and I'm thinking of how rsync works and how sometimes you get these states because long running anything is going to be vulnerable to breaks, and that's kind of what I'm curious. I'm thinking from the network perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, you get a user coming in and complaining, okay, I rebooted my laptop and now here it is. I don't know what's going on, but it's working really hard doing something, and we're like, I don't know, we start looking at processes or trying to figure out what's going on. I'm just curious if that's an arcane world that it's difficult to deal with when you're talking to a user and they don't know how to look at logs and they don't know what the log messages mean, or is it in real life? Does it fix itself? Does it tend to work? And
Well, if the file is gone, obviously it can't fix that part of the transfer, but it should keep going through the itinerary. So, if it's file 3 is missing, but then file 4 is there, it should say that there was a fault transfer in file 3, and move on to file 4 and finish the transfer. Whether that happens successfully in practice in all circumstances, I can't say, but that's the idea anyway. BJ, are there any other online questions?
Yes, there's one additional one about customizing Globus parallel sessions. So does that mean whether it is possible to use more parallel sessions to transfer very large files faster?
Okay, yeah, so I guess this would be the number of parallel TCP streams, the data streams that Grid FTP is using. So my understanding is that this is a server-side option. So for like Glade or for campaign storage, there's a certain number of parallel file streams that are configured, and that's what you'll get on those transfers. I don't think that that's user configurable for a particular transfer, at least not via Globus. Now, whether it's configurable for a personal endpoint, I don't think it is, but I'm not 100% sure, especially in the Linux download of that, because that's a command line utility and may have more options than the Windows and Mac ones, which are GUI utilities, graphical utilities. So my general answer would be, I don't think it provides that flexibility, but I can't 100% rule it out. All right, thanks, BJ. So it sounds like that's all the questions we had. So again, thanks for attending, and if any other questions come up, feel free to let us know. Have a good day.